Jojo's fifth part, Golden Wind, is a story of evolution, of change, of growth, and of rebirth. But what happens when your ability to change is taken away? That's exactly what happens to one of the most human, most tragic, and most lovable characters in the entire series, that being Narancia. To quickly jog your memory, Narancia is the gangstar's comic relief. Their tried and true eyes in the sky. He often acts very childish and is not the smartest mathematically. However, logically, he's one of the most adaptable and skillful characters in JoJo's as a whole. But why is that? When Narancia was only 10, his mother died from an eye disease, and his father despised and ignored him. Because of this, he left home at a very young age and lived on the street more than in his own home. He joined a gang of so-called friends and was quickly shown how evil this world could be when he was betrayed and manipulated by those same friends. After contracting his mother's disease and leaving prison, Narancia gives up on everything and accepts death for as it is. However, Bruno Bucciarati takes him in, treats him as a human, and even pays to get his eyes cured. And then Narancia chooses to join Bruno in the Passione. Here we see the main driving factor within Narancia's life. Narancia never had a proper education, so he chooses not to think for himself. Instead, he follows someone in order to be useful. At first, it was his friends in the gang, and then it was Bruno. He requires someone to look up to and trust, not out of ignorance, but because it's his natural instinct. He has lost everything in his life and was treated like trash, so it's only natural that he will devote his entire life to the one man who saw him as more. However, there is a problem within this line of thinking. Narancia accidentally confuses identity with belonging and responsibility. He chooses to take a borrowed identity from those he follows, rather than creating his own by himself. But this isn't his fault, it's quite the opposite. This is all the outcome of his past. He never became himself, not because he didn't want to, but because he was never given the space or opportunity to do so. His past and the people around him kept controlling and bringing him back down every step of the way, instead causing him to rely on others to tell him who he's supposed to be. We actually see this exact same thing happen in the boat scene halfway through Golden Wind. Narancia must choose to either stay behind with Fugo and leave his life with Bruno, or betray the boss, risking his entire life to continue along with Bruno and his friends. Here Narancia is faced with himself, with the two sides. Does he listen to his heart, or does he follow the orders of the man he looks up to? He quickly chooses to default to his norms and beggingly asks Bruno,
Narancia, 君はどうするんです？
俺、どうしよう。ねえ、ブチャラティ。俺、どうすればいい？行った方がいいと思う。
怖いか？
ああ、すごく怖いよ。でも命令してくれよ。一緒に来いって命令してくれりゃ勇気が湧いてくる。あんたの命令なら何も怖くないんだ。
ダメだ。こればかりは命令できない。お前が決めるんだ。自分の歩く道は自分が決めるんだ。わ
かんねえよ。俺、わかんね
え。だが忠告はしよう。来るな、ナランチャ。お前には向いてない。
He asks Bruno to order him, because he's never been faced with a problem like this. He's never had to make his own decision, his own path.
トリッシュは信じる人に見捨てられた。俺も昔見捨てられた。父さんからも信じてた友達からも見捨てられた。同じだ。なんか似てる。トリッシュと俺はなんか似てる。
ジョルノ、亀をくれ。トリッシュを中に入れよう。はい。ブチャラティ、
振り返ってください。ブチャラティー！行くよ！俺も行く！行くんだよ！俺に来るなと命令しないでくれ！トリシは俺なんだ！俺だ！トリシの腕の傷は俺の傷だ！
Here we see that Narancia finally chooses to follow his heart and chases after the boat. But this means more than you might think. This is the first true moment in which Narancia is given the freedom to think for himself. And yet he still chooses to follow Bruno, which not only shows his own resolve, but just how much Bruno and the Gangstars mean to him. He doesn't follow Bruno just because he saved him, but because Bruno was the first person to not see him as just something useful. He sees him as a true human being whose life is worth living. Narancia is loyal because Bruno is the reason he wants to live. He chooses to jump into the vast unknown, that not only being the ocean, but physically being the idea of trusting in himself in order to hopefully change, to hopefully grow and become something more. Now not only for himself, but for Bruno, Giorno, Mista, Abbacchio, and now even Trish. He's ignorant of his emotions not out of choice, and when the biggest decision of his entire life is presented, he is finally able to break out of that ignorance and do something for himself. Narancia's stand Aerosmith, or Little Bomber for dub watchers and localizations, is a physical and yet reverse manifestation of Narancia's own dreams. Aerosmith is obviously a plane, which means it has the ability to fly almost anywhere freely through the sky, looking down at the world. This is what Narancia hopes his life would be like. But in reality, he is constantly being grounded and trapped in a cage by his emotions and past. His stand can go freely anywhere, yet he as a person is never able to choose one direction to go. He always needs to be pointed somewhere by someone. It is a heavy yet real contradiction between reality and dreams. Aerosmith embodies the very freedom and perspective that Narancia so heavily lacks. Narancia sadly dies in the final arc of Golden Wind, tragically killed by Diavolo's hands. But his death means more than just emotion. It is a physical imagery of how he was internally trapped in a cage of emotions his entire life. No matter what he did, it was too much, and he had no ability to change it. He literally, and I mean literally, died caged to the ground, unable to freely exist for himself. This death represents how not everyone, no matter how pure, is always in control. And especially in Golden Wind, the system itself is often the root cause of it. What's even worse is that for Narancia's entire life up to this point, he had no main goal, no dream. However, just before his death, he finally starts to imagine a life beyond the Passione, saying,
俺、ネアポリスに帰ったら学校行くよ。熱々のピッツァも食いてえ。奈良の木の薪で焼いた故郷の本物のマルガリータだ。ポルチーニだけも乗っけてもらおう。そんで、もしフーゴのやつに会えたら、頭悪いってまたバカにされんのも結構いいかもな。アバッキオはいなくなっちまったけど。トニッシュ、あんたは最後まで守り抜くぜ。俺たちが。
But sadly, the very moment he imagines a tomorrow never comes. Narancia rarely starts change. He simply reacts to it based on trauma. He was raised to only think about how to survive today and not what to do next week, because next week is never promised. So when he finally does initiate that change, it hurts that much more. Golden Wind is full of people changing. Narancia, however, is one of the few who doesn't. Not because he couldn't, but because life never gave him enough time. I think the largest parallel to Narancia is actually Giorno. Giorno is the physical embodiment of change. Think about it. His stand, it's changing things into life. He specifically goes into part 5 knowing exactly who he wants and what he wants to become, what he wants to do for the world. Narancia, on the other hand, goes into part 5 having no idea where he wants to go with his life. Giorno causes and inspires change both physically with his stand and emotionally to the people around him, while Narancia hopes that change will magically happen. This is important because it acts as a constant showing of how, while the system is the cause for change, and the lack thereof, there is still a degree of control one has over it. Giorno grew up in a fairly similar situation to Narancia, both having no parents from a young age and living a majority of their life on the street. However, Giorno gains a dream while Narancia doesn't. This is what causes their lives to split apart in opposite directions. Both of them are grounded by the system, but Giorno uses his dream to excel beyond this, while Narancia accidentally uses his past to hold himself down. Another gangstar that matters heavily to Narancia's character is Abbacchio, and specifically his death. Abbacchio's death hits Narancia the hardest we ever see. He breaks into heavy and real tears. However, I think a part of why Narancia felt so hurt by it was not only losing a friend, but because as each member of the Gangstars leaves or is killed, it's a pillar of his borrowed life being destroyed. And as more and more of the pillars are destroyed, he must get closer and closer to facing himself and his own true thoughts, which terrifies him more than anything. By the end of the part, after Fugo has left, Abbacchio has died, and Bruno is living on borrowed time, Narancia is his closest to being alone since he was a kid. And so the very fact he was able to dream of a future, even as simple as going to school and eating pizza, it shows just how far he's come through this part. Despite being almost all on his own, he's actually listening to himself and thinking for once. The most awful and yet truly important connection within Narancia's story has to be his deep connection to Diavolo and King Crimson. Narancia spends his life without time, while fighting for more of it. His childhood, his education, and his identity are all stolen from him at a very young age. And even after, his future is effectively stolen. Diavolo is fighting only to erase the past by using his stand, which effectively erases the future. It's a constant power struggle between fighting for and against time. And ironically enough, the very stand that erases time is the same that is used to erase Narancia's future. Golden Wind as a story teaches us that people are truly able to change as long as they believe they have a reason to live for tomorrow. Yet at the same time, it physically shows us the poetic tragedy that sometimes that just isn't enough. Sometimes the system is stronger. Narancia's death hurts. It truly does. But at the same time, it's sort of poetic that the one character who fought for freedom the most finally achieved it, but only in death. Narancia didn't die because he couldn't change. He died because, for the first time in his entire life, he finally had.